Can you start over?
So I need to repeat the fact that I'm the Grace of the Grace and Cory duo. That's
There you
the
go.
important part.
Now, and turning it over to Grace and Cory. Take it away.
So today, whoever is here because they read the title and thought this was cooking related, I'm going to just start off that I'm sorry to disappoint. I figured that's why we had such a high turnout. So I understand if you do want to drop, it's fine. It's not about the tasty dessert. And unfortunately, we're not in Ohio, so Tim can't provide tasty desserts. But for the rest of you, we can talk about the ever so exciting browser updates and death to cookies. So today, we're going to talk about, kind of start with the foundation of these updates, and then jump into the browser updates specifically, potential features and impacts, possible solutions, and really what you should be doing right now. So what are we talking about? Cookies used to be the company's best friend. It was the little nice identifier that helped companies know all about their consumers, who they were, where they've been, what they've been looking at, how to predict what they might do, essentially pretty foundational elements to a company. Well, today, we're seeing large efforts to limit and in some cases stop altogether tracking and identification methods. Now, with these methods of identification in place comes a rightful concern for people for their privacy and the need to regulate what kind of information is being collected. So that brings me to kind of what regulation means. And we're seeing regulation in two different ways. One, which most of you probably have heard about, which is the legal side of things. This is the government regulation being put in place to ensure consumers are aware of companies tracking information and gathering, and provide that opt-in, opt-out functionality to ensure people have transparency into what personal information is being collected about them. This is those GDPR, CCPA, and for those that are keeping up with the trends, CCPA has a new vote coming out in November that could make it even more stringent. So there are a lot of discussions and updates around the legal side of things that are being put in place to help from a privacy perspective. Now, in addition to those, there's the industry responses, and that's the part that we're going to talk about today. And from an industry side, I mean browsers like Safari or Chrome or Edge or Firefox and even iOS. Now they're taking this privacy initiatives into their own hands a bit and updating settings on their front to limit data and information tactics altogether without the opt-in, opt-out features, just automatically kind of cutting data collection availability off at the source. So we'll be diving into that more about what that is and the impacts during this presentation, but ultimately here wanting to distinguish between the privacy laws that are being put in place and the industry responses to what data is being collected and how it's being used on an individual. You might be thinking to yourself, well, I've heard of GDPR and CCPA, but the industry stuff sounds like a pretty big deal too. Well, it is, and things have been happening over the last couple of years, but you might not have been impacted or seen too much aspects to the data, your data being changed, for it's been on a more browser-specific level. As you can see over the last, even just this past year, Edge, Safari, Firefox have all been making little tweaks to their data privacy and being able to restrict data at different levels. Now, Safari here has been the one taking the main aspects or the main lead to this, but Safari is about 16% of the US web market, which is why you might not have heard of it until today or just recently. And in recent times, why probably most of you are here, is that in September, Apple released their iOS 14. A lot of us who have that phone had that silly update that we always have to do that breaks our phone for a little bit and all that fun stuff. But what it did was it essentially impacted all browsers coming from iOS, which is unfortunately 53% of market share versus that little 16% of web market share that Safari had. So you might be starting to see impact, if you haven't already, from these updates. I did see a question. What are your thoughts on the theory that Google and Apple are doing this to set up their own DSP inventory? Cory, I don't know you from the trend side of things, if you have thoughts on where you think it's going or the root of all this.
I think that's more likely for Google than it would be for Apple.
Say that again.
I think it's more likely for Google than it would be for Apple, because Apple is pushing for a privacy-friendly advertising network.
As much as they're calling it privacy friendly, it's more of a pain to the advertisers and the workers. So take it for what you will. But a lot of it, it really is rooted in this big push of trying to just help limit what data is being collected from people and how it's being used. And that's going to kind of continue to be seen, from long timeline made short. Things have been unfolding a bit more with rapid pace, which we see and start bringing to people's attention now because of these recent updates with Apple in particular, and what we continue to see over the next few months and next couple of years are really kind of going to snowball this effect. And at the end of the day, the industry updates that are unfolding are affecting every online business's ability to consistently identify visitors, leading to sub-optimized marketing spend, incorrect personalization, and ruining A/B testing efficacy. Now, that's an extremely bold statement that I just made about something that from our poll, some of you might be hearing for the very first time. So let's kind of double click a little bit into that and understand, sorry, I double clicked a little too far. Give me 1 second. My whole presentation got so excited about browser privacy updates that this is kind of what happens. Let's try that again. Double clicking only this far into things and talk about the browser updates and really how it is impacting you. So let's talk about what actually is happening. Have any of you seen 50 First Dates? For those of you that have, it's a great movie, let's all agree. And for those of you that haven't, essentially, Drew Barrymore had an accident that is given her short-term memory loss. And she couldn't remember anything past the day. And good old quirky Adam Sandler began to like Drew Barrymore and would have to recreate the first date every day since she kept forgetting him. Now imagine that you're a company who's like Drew Barrymore, and anytime someone came to interact with you, you forgot everything after a day. That's essentially the effects of the browser updates. Browsers are blocking or refreshing data anywhere from 24 hours to 7 days. So knowing this, not having that knowledge can affect a wide range of elements for a business, from audience segmentations becoming inaccurate, retargeting, optimization, functionality disjointed, all sorts of things are starting to be impacted because we don't know who these consumers are and how they're interacting with sites. And by not being able to understand, remember, and interact properly with your consumers, it really boils down to the fact that these updates prevent companies from knowing who consumers are, where they come from, what they did on your site, and did anything that you did matter, like your personalization or marketing efforts that you're throwing billions of dollars into. Because once people left for the day or that week, you might not have any data anymore to give you these answers. So I'm gonna pause here for a little second and let that question sink in. Because can you imagine having to be Drew Barrymore and figure out why Adam Sandler is coming up to you every day with no recollection? Now, I love a good Adam Sandler movie as much as the next guy, but that sounds a little bit torturous. as well, it's happening to businesses now. And as businesses not understanding that these core functions of your consumers is going to affect your marketing, your optimization, your analytics, and your business decisions. So now that we kind of get an understanding of what just happened or what's happening and going to continue to kind of snowball, let's talk about why you really want to start caring about it and how it's impacting your businesses. So from a marketing perspective, there's a wide range that this could kind of be impacting you. Anywhere from your ad spend inaccuracy, broken attribution models, inability to remarket, consumer journey mapping is limited, a whole bunch of things efforts that you're doing with marketing. A good example of this is take a second to think you're running a Facebook campaign and someone clicks on your ad like me, and I go to the site and I really like what you purchased or what you're selling, and I put it in my cart and dinner's ready. So I leave my phone and I forget about it, and there's some shiny keys over here and a squirrel over there, and I forget this whole thing completely. And 8 days later, I remember that I actually really wanted that thing and inevitably do what we all would have done anyway and buy it. The company sees that as a completely new user and someone that has organically found the site and purchased all on their own. They have no connection back to that ad spend. So that's going to really start impacting, an example of how this is really affecting from a marketing perspective. From an optimization side, anything from a personalization becomes difficult, loss of sticky treatments, and underlying assumptions with statistical tests are starting to be violated and inaccurate. Another good example, you're running an A/B test for 30 days because, let's be real, you need that amount of days to get a significant amount of traffic to make it a viable test. Well, 30 days is way past that 24 to 7-day window we've been discussing. That same person is going to potentially be in both buckets and have a much harder time authenticating your traffic and have a poor user experience because now the button is in 2 different places on the site because that's where you've been testing it. And all these different things are impacting how you're able to optimize and really see what's affecting your site from that level. From an analytics side, now this one might be the quote obvious one because if it's impacting data is blocked, well, of course, then data is affected. But what does that actually mean, data is affected? Well, it's affecting everything you need to know from users' consumer journey to segmentations to inflation of new users, wrong recencies, any kind of core foundational data that you're basing your company off of and your decisions off of that you've been working so hard to get to is starting to be inaccurate, lost, and skewed. And so with that, with your core foundations of analytics, marketing, and optimization being inaccurate, that's going to lead to your business decisions anywhere from your financial, consumer, or product decisions that you're making off of these now skewed foundations can cause impromptu and inaccurate business decisions. The world you built your general foundation off of is changing. And so you really need to make sure that we're understanding how it's being affected before you start pulling the different levers of your company because you're seeing differences in your data. Might not actually be the data, might be what's actually happening with the browser. But wait, you thought that was all doom and gloom. Don't worry, there's plenty more. These impacts are expected to expand to Chrome by 2022. That little 16% that we talked about earlier from Safari's percent of web market share, imagine once it starts to expand to Chrome and all the other browsers. Additionally, Google and Safari have been proposing changes of how attribution works. So even within the space, things are starting to change in that aspect. Safari also wants to delete all client-side storage. So when the user isn't even logged, when users aren't logged in, having that information deleted as well. And then of course, any efforts that you're trying to make, like fingerprinting or CNAMEs, those things are being recognized and blocked as well, or projected to be blocked. Now, ultimately, the thing that I want you to take away from this past doom and gloom sections is that you may not have heard of these changes, or you might not be affected significantly over the past couple of years. But things are snowballing quickly and will present quite the challenges as they do for your tools, your current solutions, and your larger business decisions moving forward. Don't worry, I'm not here to just tell you all the bad things. There are approaches to mitigate these impacts and changes. So some solutions that are starting to take in place, is shifting of first-party data. And for those less technical folks like myself, it's a fancy way of saying changing where the data is going and coming from to be from your site and have more control over that. Additionally, you might start seeing more communication and data trading between vendors. That communication and partnerships within the industry may be one of the ways that you map out and map your consumer data, is having those sort of relationships built. And finally, kind of that third grouping is building models or different states in which the data is rooted to really help fill the gaps or provide the direction information as business decisions and impact. And so those three really kind of go down to those three buckets of industry solutions. Again, that's the partnerships we were talking about, of having data going between different vendors. Vendor solutions, which is more technical. There are options on Google Tag Managers, Heliums, all those more technical aspects to try and work around the lost data. And then your agency internal solution. So what we are seeing is a lot more leaning into modeling. So to model your data to help fill the gaps that are lost by these blocks. And if all those don't work, or we're not quite there yet, you can also take some precautions up front by considering putting in the process things to validate your data quality regularly. So, if there isn't something necessary right now to do, it's keeping up and making sure that you're monitoring and not pulling those levers that we said from a business decision just based off of a reaction of data, but really making sure that you're keeping up with what the process is and validating that quality. Because unfortunately, there is no silver bullet right now. And so there is gonna most likely be a combination of those three efforts to try and figure out what you can do now and in the future in order to help work with the industry as it does continue to grow. So now that I have told you that there is a problem, it's growing, and there's no silver bullet, and I laugh a little bit because Cory Underwood, my partner in crime here, his nickname at our company is Dr. Doom, because all this sort of stuff is just sort of a little bit doom and gloom. What can you be doing right now? Well, the big one is to educate. Educate about your company and your impact. How are you being impacted? What is happening? What is being affected? What are those elements that you need to be aware of for the future impact? And that's other part of the education, which is staying up to date on those changes. It's not a set it and forget it. It's not a, cool, I'm not that affected, so I'm good to go. I don't need to read up on this or think about this anymore. It's quite the contrary. You, if anything, especially if you're not affected and making any changes in the current situation, you need to keep up with the trends to make sure those things aren't snowballing and affecting you later. And from that foundation of education, that's when you can dive into discussing options and strategize. As I said before, because there is no real one silver bullet with all this, it may need to figure out what are the best options for the short term, long term, and what do you need to rethink altogether? And we can pause the great question of, will Google and Facebook ads be considered first or third party? Cory can correct me if I'm wrong, but those are going to be third party. Yes.
Depends on how they work. So if you want them to be like retargeting a specific audience on websites other than the website that you're loading their script on, then they're executing in third party, and that does not work on iOS. It does not work in Safari. It's probably not going to work as you think it would in Edge or Firefox. If, however, you're only caring about measurement on your site specifically, then you can run them in first party, and then you have to deal with the fact that you still might not be able to get data from Edge and Firefox, but Safari could arbitrarily limit you to only doing data collection for 24 hours, which by extension applies to anything on iOS.
And that answer of it depends, unfortunately, is a lot of times the answer in this browser privacy things, because not only is there variance between, well, what browser are you using and what browser, how it impacts and affects the data, but also how each company sets up the data on their side, and tagging and tracking and all that sort of stuff can vary of how you're actually impacted. So there is no, again, that goes back to there is no one size fits all, but why it's so important right now to educate, understand how you are affected, because it is so unique to each client, to be able to then make those strategies to be able to figure out how to negate this in the future or work around it in the future. And so if after all this, you're like, well, this doesn't affect me, it doesn't bother me, I don't care, I'm sure I'm fine, who's this schmuck talking at Web Analytics Wednesday, I'm sure she doesn't know anything. Well, fine, I'll take that for what it is. But there are some things you could do to go check it out on your own, just to get a gut check. And this is by no means everything to check, and by no means telling you exactly what's wrong, because as I said before, everything is a little bit different. But a good gut check to just see how you may be impacted is some of these areas to look in for yourself. So the first one is using iOS and Safari traffic percent. So as I said before, this is the main areas being affected right now. So by seeing how much percent that you're affected can really showcase how much of your data is being affected. Additionally, from your paid media side, you can check how your paid media is set up. If it's deployed client-side tag manager like a GTM, it's very possible that your pixels may be blocked or not working. If you run any optimization, check your testing platforms and see how your cookies are set. How they're set can show if you have blockers in your ability to persist experiences or have skewed results. And then finally, if you want to jump into your code, you can look for a document.cookie, can show anything attached to this is most likely going to be affected. And if you don't want to do any of that, or again, for you less technical folks like myself, I will make a little plug here to Search Discovery. We are offering free high-level scans that do this sort of higher audit of your current setup to see where you may be impacted, to just help you start having those conversations and just have you start understanding where you may be impacted and to start looking into where those things are. This is really a big place to start, and it, again, roots in education. Pause for a good question of what do we think about the proposed hash email method for identifying users?
It's largely going to depend on how that technically works, but additionally to that, there are legal aspects for using email for marketing purposes. So depending on the jurisdiction of both where you are and where the user is, that may not even be viable because legally it would be prohibited. So you have to figure out, can you legally do it? And then can you technically do it? And then does the customer actually provide the email to make it work? So there's a couple of different scenarios you have to walk through to think about the likelihood. With that said, we are seeing a lot of retargeting vendors use a hashed email or log something common between two sites to power that remarketing. Now the question is going to be, should Prop 24 for California pass? That might be illegal inside of 2 years. So the next couple weeks are going to be very interesting, because if California's law passes, then we are going to see a large shift in how what they term as cross-textual consent behavioral advertising takes place. So cross-context behavioral targeting.
Can you say that 3 times really quickly?
Cross-context behavioral targeting.
Well done.
Yes. So they've, and so under the proposed law, you can use personally identifiable information such as email for marketing purposes, except in cross-context behavioral advertising targeting, because that is different. So they actually want you to get consent prior to using it in a retargeting scenario. Even if you own both of the websites, as long as they are distinctly branded, it's considered cross-context. So we'll see if that passes. Current polling has a 77% chance of passing.
And this all goes back to all of the things happening to regulate. And this one area that we're diving in allows us, I want to be careful how I say this, flexibility in trying to work around the system because it isn't legal regulated. So that, you have your legal privacy where we can help you comply, because we will help you comply. Or you have your industry ones, which I think we're all trying to figure out a little bit more of how we can help recover or figure out ways around getting the data needed that may have been blocked. And that's it. So real quick, just sort of the last thing, and then I would love to spend even more time on questions. Key takeaways. If there is nothing else that you leave today with, other than this was not a cooking show, browser updates are happening and they will continue to impact your data. This will cause gaps in your company's data affecting marketing, optimization, analytics, and business decisions. And a really, really good next step, as we've already kind of gotten a hint into, is because everything is so unique to each situation, start to educate yourself on how this is affecting and going to affect your business to ensure successful executions and growth.
There's another question, but it dips back into GDPR, things you can't do, I believe.
So even if you get permission from the user, if the browser blocks it, it doesn't matter. So we're not only seeing things that you need to implement from a legal framework point of view, where you need to get consent prior to using data in this way. However, because of what the browsers are doing, we're also forcing a heavy retooling of how websites functionally work under the hood. So a lot of the client-side tagging and stuff that became popular over the past decade is subject to, say, ad blockers, and that used to be, okay, well, if they don't install the ad blocker, then do we care? But it's a whole different scenario when the stuff starts doing that by default. It used to be that, cookies would persist until either they expired, somebody reinstalled the browser, or someone bought a whole new device. But now, Firefox deletes known trackers every 24 hours. Safari might delete them after 24 hours. Edge won't even transmit a cookie if it exists, if it's to a domain that it thinks is trying to track you and you don't have sufficient site engagements for. So different things could potentially still work if they're built differently. But at the same time, that's going to force companies to reinvest a huge amount of money reworking what their website architecture looks like.
We have another question about the server-side tracking. Does that solve everything?
It does not, because of how it works, but it gets closer to that direction. So server-side GTM uses client-side JavaScript to forward it to a server-side endpoint, which then sends that out to additional targeting. But the fact that the client's involved at all means it can potentially break. So it gets further because it's not calling those endpoints directly, but at the same time, it's not as probably long-term viable as you would be if you did server-to-server communication, because then the browser doesn't see it at all.
The questions are
So
flying fast and furious. I could
break-
read them, or if you want to start cherry picking them, they're
So
good.
the next one
Fantastic
is
questions.
break site usage features like remembering your login or return to your bank site. So Safari has two different, you can set a cookie two different ways. You can use JavaScript, or you can set that through a server-side response header on a request to a server. Safari says if you set it with JavaScript, the site owner may be unaware of what's going on, and so limits the destructive potential of that technique by artificially capping how long that persistence can stick around. They do state, however, that if you're going through the effort to retool your server to do that specifically, they'll let that through. So in the case of remembering login, that should be done technically through a server-side header, because you would not, in theory, want the JavaScript to have access to that from a security purpose. So they won't break that yet. However, I think that ultimately we could see a large-scale shift in the next couple of years if they figure out how to do authentication without relying on cookies. I don't know what DevKey is, so I don't have a point of view on it.
Jump in, Tony, if you want to unmute, if you can.
Yeah. So my understanding. Yeah. Thanks for talking about this stuff. This is a new proposal from Google about a new version of the privacy sandbox that appears to be a bit of a power grab from Google. And so I haven't looked into it very deeply, but it was called Sparrow, and now it's called DoveKey. It's they're using these very esoteric Soviet era code names for all of their skunk works things, but it's apparently the new privacy sandbox initiative.
So their privacy sandbox is interesting because it actually allows them billions of potential identifiers as opposed to, because of the number of bits in that identifier. So maybe. Now, the thing is, if Chrome adopts it, but nobody else does, then you have a solution that works for one browser. So that doesn't really get you what you're looking for, because while they control 65% of the market entirely, in North America, Safari, like iOS, is actually 53% of the mobile market. So as more and more stuff transitions to mobile, the potential fix that offers won't likely exceed 50% unless they can get Safari to play ball. And if they go too far in one direction and Apple doesn't agree, then we're going to see a divergence. And it could be that they just can't market to Apple device users.
That makes sense.
Which is something that Facebook's dealing with, because Facebook said that when the app changes go in next year, they're going to have to see, but they're skeptical it would even make sense to offer their audience network on iOS, because they don't think they're going to get enough of a match rate to be able to do anything.
So, I mean, there's got to be some kind of publisher revolt, no?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's possible, but it's not like Apple needs the money. So
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you.
And that kind of goes to the next question. I would agree that it's not just a technical problem. We are having lots of conversations here, even anywhere from technical solutions to how do we even just change how we optimize? And do we need to rethink our optimization strategies to accommodate this? And it might not even be, again, a fix. It might have to be a reframing of how we collect data or interpret data, or what data we're using to make those decisions. fun times.
So I agree with Hill. It's not just a technical problem. You got to really think about what your requirements are. And the important thing to realize is your dev team didn't build it incorrectly to begin with. A lot of this stuff has been deployed over the last year to 2 years. And so what likely was seen as a viable long-term strategy 3 or 4 years ago just may not be the case. And so as the scenario changes, the company has to be willing to write off what they've previously done and possibly re-implement things that they had working just to keep the site working like it did. And then I agree that things are likely going to be rough for remarketing and programmatic. Programmatic is being reviewed for legal eligibility in the EU. So we'll see if that falls afoul of GDPR. But a lot of that stuff comes from knowing something about the customer so you can tailor the bid. Like, you know that they had previously seen something so you can spend more, or they're in certain areas. So certain classifications of programmatic might stop being viable. So you can't do bid adjustments off certain variables just because you no longer have access to them. So if a site requires login to enter, how will ads, optimization, and impact analytics be impacted by these changes? It depends on how those respective platforms work. So if all of the stuff is being ran through client-side JavaScript, it's likely to work badly, or at least not like you think it is. If parts of that are ran through server-side proxies as part of a on-demand generation of the page, then that's probably going to work a lot better, at least under the current architecture. And we'll have to see. So, like, for example, Conductrix and SiteSpect offer server-side testing solutions. And because of the way the tests are built, they don't care about this. You have some server-side, like if you happen to take Google Analytics and you fired all of your measurement hits through measurement protocol rather than through a tag manager, you might not even notice this. If you're using all JavaScript, that's probably not going to work out well for you.
We have a pause. So I have, while this was going on, definitely confirmed that I effed up and did not get breakout rooms re-enabled on my account. So we will not be doing the breakout room portion of this. So I now do have a to-do on my list to get that figured out in the next week. So if you come back in November, I got 2 strikes, but I'm confident that I will be doing that correctly next month. So what we're going to do is pause and do the door prizes, and then we'll kind of just hang out with more questions. So if you have questions and thought you didn't want to take the time to type your question because you didn't want to miss what was being said, I'm now going to drone on for a few minutes, and now's a good time to type a question, and then we'll hang out for a few more minutes. And I am not going to try to pull up another slide, because all the slide says is that our door prize is $50 DoorDash gift cards, since most of us are still not out and about. And that's the closest we can get to providing food to a few people. So we work with PricewaterhouseCoopers for a fully audited process for random selection of winners. It's maybe not quite that rigorous, but we do actually have a process we feel pretty good about for randomly picking our 3 winners. And the winners of our $50 gift cards must be present to win. Ooh, Jason, looks like we lost one. I think Brian Foley is gone. Okay, so we will move on down the list. The next winner is Dustin Bowden, who is still here. Outstanding.
Woo!
And the next one is Josh Borstein, also still here. Congratulations. And then the final winner is Kaylee Knight, who is also still here. So congratulations. I will be private messaging you to get the email address to send your DoorDash gift card to, and you'll have a moderate meal on Web Analytics Wednesday at some point, and you can think fondly, and maybe you should order cookies with wherever you order from. It should be somewhere that has cookies to make up for this topic and the depression of it. So with that, we'll go back to the ITP timeline. So I will turn it back over to you guys for some more questions. We'll probably go for as long as the questions are flowing, but probably no more than 10 or 15 minutes, and go from there. And I'm going to keep recording this because these seem like they're good questions leading to good discussion.
So I do see Apple working with data protection authorities because they will likely be required by law to do so. And if they want to continue operating in said country, they probably have to play nice with the government. So that's where I think that's going to end up. Then Tim correctly said it's dangerous to think of finding workarounds because it's not necessarily a workaround as much as it is a shift in architecture that is not subject to those challenges. So the types of constraints are changing. With that said, there are other valid architectures that don't get subject to those constraints. So it's kind of like an igloo is a viable piece of construction if you are in a place full of snow, but it is probably not going to work for you in the desert. Then DoveKey apparently is, instead of reaching out to ad servers, the browser does all the calculation, and I would be super interested in how that pans out, because I would think that if you have everything being done on the client, it is a security nightmare when you're dealing about things with money and how much to charge people for showing an ad. Because if I can modify the client, then potentially I could drive up what that looks like. So be interested to see if people break that and how quickly that happens, because ad fraud is a thing. Does this affect web analytics versus ad tags? And the answer is it affects both, potentially in different ways. So for web analytics, depending on how it's constructed, your primary reporting suite can skew certain pieces of data, particularly when you're doing things like cohort analysis or cross-session analysis, things that require some concept of history, like you're building a timeline. If you never have that starting point, you only know what's the present. So things get bucketed incorrectly and stuff like that. For the ad tags, they might also have that issue, but then they also just might not work. So for example, Firefox aggressively blocks known trackers from getting cookies. And if that's how the particular ad tag works, it needs a cookie. Even if it's first party, it doesn't get access to it. It doesn't get transmitted with that network request. It does not work. So even though you're calling the ad service doesn't have that initial identifier to say, hey, this thing happened from this person. And in that instance, if one is working right and the other is not, you could see a pretty sizable delta between the two. Conversely, if you had one working right, like your analytics platform, and the ad tag wasn't working, you would think not only would you see a delta, but the analytics platform could potentially get the attribution right, even though if you look on the ROI calculation in the vendor platform, it's going to be probably potentially some order of magnitude less, depending on your exact browser mix breakdown. Tags for third-party vendors would be affected depending on how they work and on if they are classified as tracking So Firefox uses like a list done by disconnect me to identify what it knows as trackers, and then out of that it goes through some calculations to figure out how it should or if it should even mess with that system. Edge does something similar with their trust protection lists. So depending on how they work, they might be impacted. It is time to start industry standards for analytics to work with browser vendors, and there is a GitHub group that you can join to discuss all of these privacy issues with the people who are designing the solutions for how to solve them. And I can get that.
A GitHub? You said a GitHub group?
There is a GitHub group.
Oh.
And I am subscribed to the repo, and so I get emails whenever someone comments on something.
Just for those who don't know, Till's attending from Germany, so middle of the night. He's for him.
I do think that the pending antitrust investigation may result in changes for Google on how it collects and or shares data if Congress gets the FTC to engage the DOJ to bring suit. Whether that happens or not is a big question mark. And so the other possibility would be bipartisan bill passing in Congress for a data privacy law, which so far has failed multiple times. So I think given the current administration and the legislation, the chances of that happening are slim. The elections could particularly change the control of the Senate and the presidency. So depending on which ways that go, I would say that is either more or less likely in the next 4 years. Retro is always cool. And I don't think you need to go all the way back to reading log files. Although if you have that skill, that could ultimately come in handy before long.
We'll make sure that Cory will track down the GitHub group, and we will post it on we'll do like a show recap where we'll have the recording of this video, and we'll make sure we've kind of tracked down that's something that can be, that's a group that the link can be published publicly, yes. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, anyone there, and they want people to go and chat with them. So if you have a strong viewpoint on something that they're thinking about doing, and you don't voice that, and then they do it, well, you might have been the voice that caused them to differently, and if you got them, that's probably your fault. So I encourage you to engage with the group. There is a complaint that Google is unilaterally driving standards. However, there is also a complaint that Apple is unilaterally driving standards. So half dozen of one, 6 of the other. Yeah. What are the chances that any antitrust settlement will be intelligently thought out? And I would go with close to 0. The thing is, though, like, so much of this gets into the weeds very quickly, and I am skeptical of people without a technical background getting enough of the context to think it through in a way that would make sense.
Well, and this is it fair? I mean, we sort of had it with the two of you kind of really kind of as a way to speak to this, is you're talking to clients who are grappling with this. You are kind of more the bearer of bad news, and it's bad news about if we do nothing, things get worse, right? Like that can't be a message that anybody want. Congratulations. If we do exactly what we've been doing, we'll be delivering less value. You need to spend money and invest time and resources to not even quite even maintain the status quo.
Right.
Yeah, kind of. But It's this big push of, people apparently care if they're being followed by online data and Facebook and all this sort of stuff. And it's raised quite a bit of chatter from everybody to try and prevent that. And so with power comes great responsibility. So as these things were allowing us to track data and those things, it's now requiring, I think people are reacting and pulling some strings to make it tighter. So to your point, yes, if we do nothing, things are going to break and your data is going to be wrong. And the things that we're doing, it's not a golden ticket, but at least it's better than doing nothing.
So I did post a link to the GitHub group in the chat because I found that while Grace was talking. If 24 passes, it's not illegal to capture data points under the current proposition of the law. If you want to read all 53 pages of it, it is on the Ballotpedia link I posted earlier. But with that said, customers would get more control over what they what you can and cannot use their data for. So regardless of the technical design that your site is subject to, you would need to comply with the regulation for servicing people in California if you are one of the groups that that law applies to. And as far as for how soon this rolls out, California typically leads the way in the United States because it has one of the largest market share. Like, they drive a huge segment of the economy, right? So then your company gets to have the fun conversation. Do we standardize to the most restrictive data law that we have to deal with? Or do we make all of the processes insanely more complicated by treating California as special? And there's some pros and cons to each. Now, obviously, if you're going to treat California as special, then the training and stuff goes way up because now you're dealing with multiple scenarios.
I think I remember Stefan Hamel trying to take just from the regulatory side, trying to line up, and he concluded that it would be impossible to behave in a way that complied with all current regulations.
It's not, because, for example, CCPA is opt-out, GDPR is opt-in. So if you are trying to align to the CCPA, you are against the GDPR, but if you're complying to the GDPR, then you are losing data that you could otherwise have under the CCPA.
But I think he was going a little deeper than kind of just the opt-out, opt-in, and a little bit more to even kind of the data handling side.
Right.
Yeah.
And Japan just updated their data privacy laws this past June, and Brazil has a huge data privacy initiative that they published. And so if you are doing business internationally, particularly if you're transferring data out of Europe, you should be very concerned, and you probably want to look at the most recent court rulings.
Well, I
I'm here.
think. Wait, what?
I would have to look up when it takes effect.
Okay. Well, I think this is probably a good time to wrap. I kind of neglected to actually thank both of you for doing this when you were done with the main presentation, because we slid so smoothly into Q&A. But thank you both, Grace and Cory, for presenting and the discussion. And thanks to everyone who attended. I don't know that we've had this many string of solid and engaged questions at a Web Analytics Wednesday. So hopefully you found it useful and fun, and 3 of you will get food out of it. And hopefully we will see you next month. If you registered for this through the website or have registered in the past, you will get emails a couple of weeks out from our next event. If not, you can sign up on cbuswa.com and you'll get notified of future events. But hopefully someday we will be back in person, although it is kind of cool to have people from all over the country and the world attending. So that is kind of the one silver lining to this. I didn't actually say Grace is in New York and Cory is in the middle of nowhere in Michigan. Is that fair?
Yes, I'm actually in the middle of nowhere.
Okay. But so thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully we will see many, if not most of you next month.
And then I would say, it's not snowing here yet, but I would say the biggest thing that I would say, in addition to the browser privacy stuff we discussed, is Apple's changing the app guidelines for data collection in iOS next year, and they will become very close to GDPR. So even if you are in the United States, if you are doing any sort of data collection through iOS, that is a process that you will need to undertake.
I like that you just dropped that bomb on us as you're about to leave. Like we didn't.
Time. Thanks everyone. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, all your apps
One more
is going to
thing.
require really restrictions.
You could tell my mouse was hovering over the end button. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your evening and rest of your week. Bye.